7 years of loyalty ended with a single word: useless. Jihan Yu heard it from the mouth of the man he had bled for more than anyone else in Kiro's guild. Guts stood over him, arms crossed, not even bothering to lower his voice. Behind him, the rest of the strike team watched in silence, and none of them looked away in shame. They simply watched, the way people watch something being thrown out with the trash. Only minutes earlier, Jihan had been holding a monster back with his own body. The creature was a mutated boar type, easily twice the size of anything the team had fought before, and its tusks had already opened a long gash across Jihan's shoulder. He had planted his shield and taken every charge meant for his teammates, absorbing hit after hit while his mana reserves burned down to nothing. At one point, his knees buckled. He called out for support, just once, his voice cracking from the strain. Nobody moved. Kim Hunai was busy repositioning for a cleaner shot. Sun was reloading his crossbow gauntlet and pretended not to hear. Mia Li glanced at him, then looked away, focused on her own survival instead. By the time the monster finally went down, Jihan was on one knee, blood soaking through his sleeve, his shield arm hanging useless at his side. He expected concern. He expected someone to check if he was still breathing. Instead, Guts walked past the corpse of the beast and crouched in front of him, studying him the way a man studies a tool that has finally worn out. "You slowed us down again," Guts said. "If you'd actually hit something instead of just standing there, this fight would have ended twice as fast." Jihan tried to speak, but his throat was too dry, and the words came out broken. He had taken every hit meant for 4 other people. He had done exactly what a shield was supposed to do. None of that seemed to matter in Guts' eyes. "We've been carrying you for years," Guts continued. "Guild's better off without dead weight." The severance came in an envelope, handed over without ceremony, as if he were being paid off for an inconvenience rather than 7 years of service. Jihan stared at it, then at the 4 faces surrounding him, searching for even one flicker of guilt. He found none. Kim Hunai smirked. Sun didn't even bother hiding his relief. Mia Li kept her eyes on the ground, but she didn't argue either. 7 years. 7 years of standing between them and death, and this was the ending they had prepared for him, without ever telling him it was coming. He walked out of the monster area alone, his shoulder still bleeding, his guild insignia stripped from his jacket before he even reached the exit gate. Nobody offered him a healing potion. Nobody offered him a ride back into the city. He limped through the barrier checkpoint, past hero staff who barely glanced at him, and out into a night that felt colder than it should have. For 7 years, Jihan Yu had told himself that loyalty mattered, that if he kept protecting people, kept absorbing the damage so others could shine, eventually it would be recognized. He realized now, walking through empty streets with his own blood drying on his skin, that he had been telling himself a story that was never true. To Kiros, he had never been a teammate. He had only ever been furniture that happened to move. He didn't cry. He wanted to, but something in him had gone numb, past the point where tears made sense. He sat down on the curb outside a shuttered noodle stand, the envelope of severance money still clutched in his fist, and he realized, with a strange hollow clarity, that he had absolutely no idea what came next. That was when the light appeared. It didn't announce itself with thunder or a booming voice from the sky. It started small, a faint blue-green shimmer curling around his fingers like mist that refused to dissipate. Jihan flinched back, certain at first that his exhaustion was playing tricks on him. But the light grew, wrapping around his wrist, then climbing his arm, cool and strange against his skin. A presence pressed into his mind, not words exactly, but something close to words. A feeling of ancient patience settling around him like a current of wind that had been waiting a long time to be noticed. Silp. He didn't know the name yet, not consciously, but somehow it surfaced anyway, the way a memory surfaces from somewhere you never visited. The wind around him picked up, rustling through the empty street even though the night had been perfectly still moments before. Loose papers spun in a slow circle near his feet. A vending machine sign rattled on its hinges. Jihan tried to stand and staggered, his legs weak from blood loss and shock, but the moment his palm touched the pavement, a pulse of energy rushed through him, sharp and electric, chasing the pain from his shoulder like a tide pulling back from the shore. Something ancient had chosen him. He didn't understand why, not yet, but he understood enough to know that whatever this was, it changed everything about what he thought his life would look like tomorrow. The wound on his shoulder closed, slowly, the torn skin knitting itself back together as the wind spirit's power settled into his core. He flexed his fingers, feeling strength return in a way that felt entirely foreign, like borrowing a body that wasn't quite his own. A voice, or something like a voice, whispered a single concept into his thoughts. Contract formed. He had heard of elemental contracts before, the way anyone in hero society had heard of them, as legend more than reality. Elementalists were rare enough that most guilds went their entire existence without ever recruiting one. To form a bond with a spirit required a soul the spirit found worthy, and spirits like Sylph almost never bothered looking twice at anyone. Yet here he was, an expelled support hero with nothing left to his name, suddenly carrying wind itself inside his chest. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even fully process it. He simply sat there on the curb, as dawn crept over the rooftops, slowly turning his hand this way and that, watching faint traces of green light dance across his knuckles before fading. He allowed himself a single thought that wasn't despair, the first one since the boss fight. Maybe they were wrong about him. Word of an unaffiliated hero suddenly registering a rare elemental class travels fast in certain circles, faster than Jihan expected. By the time he reached the public registration office 2 days later, his shoulder fully healed and his new power still unfamiliar in his hands, a small guild had already sent someone to intercept him before he even finished his paperwork. Her name was Kim, and she introduced herself as the leader of a guild called Epic, before Jihan had even looked up from the registration form. Epic wasn't a guild anyone had heard of. It ranked near the bottom of the national listings, a two-person operation clinging to survival through smaller contracts and cleanup jobs nobody else wanted. Kim herself was younger than Jihan expected a guild leader to be, with ink-stained fingers from constantly scribbling spell formulas and an expression that shifted between fierce determination and complete social awkwardness within the same sentence. "I heard the registration alert," she admitted, practically vibrating with excitement. "Wind Elementalist, do you have any idea how rare that is? I've been running this guild by myself for 8 months. 8 months! And the best recruit I've gotten is a guy who quit after one monster area because he got scared of a slime." Jihan studied her for a long moment, uncertain what to make of someone this openly desperate and this openly honest about it. Every guild he had ever known operated on hidden agendas and careful appearances. Kim had neither. "I was just expelled from Kiros," he said flatly, testing her reaction. "They said I was dead weight." Kim blinked, then laughed, a short surprised sound. "Kiros expelled a guy who just contracted with a wind spirit? That's either the dumbest decision I've ever heard, or you're leaving something out." He wasn't leaving anything out. That was simply how little Kiros had understood what they were losing. She offered him a contract on the spot, terms that were laughably generous compared to what Kiros had ever given him. An actual split of guild earnings instead of a fixed low wage, equipment funding, even a small living stipend while he trained. Jihan almost didn't believe the numbers were real, but there was something in the way Kim spoke, urgent and sincere, that convinced him faster than any of her promises could. "I'm not asking you to trust me completely yet," she said. "Just work with me for a month. If I'm wasting your time, you can walk, but I don't think I am," he signed. Not because the offer was perfect, but because someone was finally looking at him like he mattered before he had proven anything at all. The first week at Epic Guild looked nothing like his years at Kiros. Kim's headquarters was a converted storage unit on the edge of the district, cluttered with half-finished spell diagrams pinned to every wall and a training dummy that had clearly seen better decades. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even particularly clean. But when Jihan asked what she wanted to focus on first, Kim didn't hesitate. "Your control," she said. "Sylph gave you raw power. Nobody gave you the instincts to use it yet. That's the gap between a wind elementalist who terrifies people and one who wastes half his mana on a gust that knocks over a trash can." She wasn't wrong. His first attempt at summoning a basic wind blade sent a gust so unfocused it knocked both of them backward and shattered a window across the street. Kim didn't scold him. She laughed until she nearly fell over, then made him try again, patiently walking him through breathing patterns and mental anchoring exercises that Sylph seemed to respond to almost instinctively. By the third day, faint lines of translucent text began flickering at the edge of his vision whenever he focused hard enough during a spar. Success probability. Optimal angle. Mana cost estimate. He froze the moment it happened, startled enough that Kim asked if he was having a stroke. "There's a system," he said slowly, still watching the numbers shift as she circled him with a wooden practice staff. "It's telling me where you're going to move." Kim's eyebrows shot up. Wind elementalists don't usually get calculation interfaces. That's not a standard elemental trait. She studied him with new interest, the kind of look people gave rare artifacts rather than people. Whatever Sylph saw in you, it's not just the wind. Neither of them understood yet how deep that hidden layer went. But Jihan felt it settling into place inside him, quiet and precise, the way a second heartbeat might feel if you suddenly noticed it after years of never knowing it was there. Training no longer felt like proving his worth to people who had already decided he had none. It felt like discovering he had capabilities nobody, including himself, had ever bothered to look for. Kiros never sent so much as a message asking how he was doing. He hadn't expected one. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet certainty was forming. One he didn't say aloud yet, not even to Kim. They had no idea what they had just thrown away. 2 weeks later, Kim decided he was ready for a real test. Rank 5 monster area, she announced, dropping a mission slip on the workbench between them. Small one, low population of monsters, mostly cockatrices. It's the kind of job most guilds send their newest recruits on, which honestly should tell you something about how far you've already come. Jihan looked at the slip, then at her. You're sending me in alone? I'm sending us in together, she corrected. But you're doing the fighting. I'll handle support casting and keep an eye on the perimeter. Consider it a live audition for Sylph. The monster area sat behind a shimmering barrier at the edge of the industrial district, an artificial pocket of overgrown wilderness stitched into a gap between warehouses. Stepping through the barrier felt like crossing into another world entirely, tall grass swallowing the sound of the city behind them, the air thick with the dry, feathered scent of nesting cockatrices. Jihan's hand went instinctively to the hilt of his old sword, a plain blade Kiros had never bothered upgrading in 7 years. It felt lighter now, or maybe he simply felt stronger holding it. The first cockatrice broke from the grass without warning, a lean reptilian bird thing with a serrated beak and eyes like wet stones. Jihan's vision flickered, faint lines of translucent text sliding into view at the edges of his sight. Dodge probability, 82%. Recommended movement, step left, pivot. He didn't question it. He moved exactly as the numbers suggested, and the creature's beak snapped through empty air where his shoulder had been a heartbeat earlier. Momentum carried him into a clean horizontal slash across its exposed flank. It shrieked once and dropped. A second one lunged from his blind side. This time he didn't even need the calculation to finish loading before his body reacted. Sylph's presence humming through his limbs, urging him faster than thought aloud. Wind gathered around his blade in a thin, translucent edge, and when he swung, the strike carried further than the sword's length should have allowed. The cockatrice folded in half before it hit the ground. Kim stood a dozen paces back, mouth slightly open, her support spell half-formed and forgotten in her palm. You've had that class for 2 weeks, she said, mostly to herself. 2 weeks, and you're already reading fights like someone with years of combat experience. Jihan didn't answer right away, still watching the fading numbers drift out of his vision. Success rate, optimal angle, mana expenditure, 7%. It was strange, having a second set of eyes inside his own head, one that never panicked, never hesitated, never once suggested that he wasn't capable of the thing standing in front of him. For 7 years at Kiros, every instinct he'd trained had been built around absorbing damage, not dealing it. Now every motion Sylph guided him through felt like discovering muscles he never knew he had. 3 more cockatrices emerged from deeper in the overgrowth, drawn by the noise. Jihan didn't retreat. He planted his feet, called a thin gust of wind to sharpen the edge of his blade, and let the numbers guide his footing as the creatures closed in from 3 separate angles. The first one he met head-on, ducking under its strike and driving upward through its throat. The second tried to flank him while he was still recovering his stance, and here the calculation flashed a warning rather than a percentage. Danger, high. Recommended action, retreat 2 steps, redirect momentum. He obeyed instantly, and the creature's talons raked through the space he had occupied a half-second before. He used the redirected momentum to spin into a wind cutter, a skill he had only practiced twice in training and never once under real pressure. A crescent blade of compressed air tore free from his sword and caught the cockatrice across the chest, dropping it instantly. The third hesitated, some instinctive animal sense recognizing that its companions had all fallen in seconds. Jihan didn't give it time to reconsider. He closed the distance himself, haste flooding his legs with borrowed speed, and ended the fight before the creature finished registering the threat. Silence settled over the clearing. Feathers drifted down through shafts of afternoon light. Kim finally lowered her hands, staring at the 3 fallen cockatrices, and then at Jihan, who stood barely winded, his mana reserve according to the readout sitting comfortably above 60%. "Okay," she said slowly. "I need to revise my entire plan for this guild." Jihan allowed himself something close to a smile, the first genuine one in longer than he wanted to count. It wasn't triumph exactly, it was closer to relief, the quiet, private relief of discovering that the years Kiros had spent calling him useless had never described anything real about what he was capable of. They cleared 4 more cockatrices before the mission slip's quota was met, Jihan growing more comfortable with the analytical overlay each time it appeared, learning to trust the numbers the way he once trusted his shield arm. By the time they exited the barrier, dusk had settled over the district, and Kim was already talking through ideas for equipment upgrades, mana efficiency drills, a dozen plans spilling out of her faster than she could organize them. Jihan let her talk, only half listening, his attention caught instead on the faint trace of green light still curling occasionally around his knuckles. Somewhere across the city, Kiros was almost certainly running their next mission short a shield. He wondered, distantly and without much heat, whether any of them had noticed yet how much heavier every fight had become without him standing in the front line absorbing the cost. They would notice eventually. He was in no hurry to make it easy for them. For now, there was only the next fight, the next skill, the next quiet proof that Sylph had seen something in him that 7 years of teammates had refused to. The old sword didn't last. It happened during a routine cleanup job the following week, a batch of lesser monsters barely worth the trip, when Jihan channeled a wind cutter and felt the blade shudder in his grip like something close to breaking. Kim noticed immediately, snatching it from his hand the moment they returned to the storage unit and turning it over under the workbench light. "This thing's been drinking mana it shouldn't," she muttered, running a finger along a hairline crack near the hilt. "Standard steel isn't built to channel elemental output. You've probably been losing a chunk of every cast just fighting the metal itself." Jihan hadn't noticed, or rather, he had noticed something felt slightly wrong every time he pushed past a certain threshold, but he'd chalked it up to his own inexperience rather than the weapon itself. It was a strange thing, realizing that a piece of equipment he'd carried unquestioned for 7 years at Kiros had never once been suited to what he was becoming. Kim knew someone, a blacksmith operating out of a cramped shop 2 districts over, a squat, thickly bearded man who insisted rather loudly and rather unconvincingly that he was human, despite standing barely to Jihan's shoulder and possessing forearms like tempered iron. He examined the cracked blade for a long moment, running a calloused thumb along the wear pattern, then looked up at Jihan with sudden sharp interest. "Elemental class," the blacksmith said, "not a question. Wind. Judging by the erosion pattern, nobody wears steel down like that except a wind user pushing far past what the metal was rated for." He disappeared into the back of his shop without waiting for confirmation, and returned 20 minutes later with a slender blade of dull gray metal, lighter than it looked, faint grooves etched along its length in a pattern that seemed almost decorative, until Jihan noticed the grooves hummed faintly the instant his fingers closed around the hilt. "Elemental conductive alloy," the blacksmith explained, "costs more than it should, and I don't hand it out to just anyone, but your friend here vouched for you, and frankly, I don't get many customers who manage to crack a standard blade in under a month." Jihan tested a small gust through the new sword, and the difference was immediate, the wind gathering along the grooves without resistance, the mana cost readout in his vision dropping by nearly a third compared to his old blade. It felt less like wielding a weapon, and more like the sword itself was listening. "Thank you," Jihan said, and meant it more than the simple words carried. The blacksmith waved him off gruffly, already turning back toward his forge. "Just don't crack this one too. Come back if the grooves start dimming. Means you're outgrowing it again." Outside the shop, Kim was practically bouncing on her heels. "See, this is what I mean. 2 months ago you didn't even have an elemental class. Now blacksmiths are worried about you outgrowing custom alloy weapons. Do you have any idea how insane that sounds?" Jihan turned the new blade over in the evening light, watching the faint grooves catch the last of the sun. He thought, briefly and without bitterness, of Guts standing over him in that monster area, calling him dead weight while his shoulder still bled. They had looked at him for 7 years and seen nothing worth keeping. Kim had looked at him for barely a month and seen someone worth investing in completely. The gap between those two judgments felt more and more like the truest measure of who had actually understood him. That night, back at the storage unit, Kim pulled up the Guild Network's public mission board, scrolling through available contracts with the sharp focus of someone hunting for exactly the right opportunity. "There's a job posted for a mutant sighting near the northern MA cluster," she said, frowning slightly at the listing. "Cockatrice type, but the report says its coloring's off, and it took down 2 rank 6 heroes before they abandoned the job. Bounty's solid, but the risk rating's higher than anything we've touched." Jihan leaned over her shoulder, reading the listing twice. Something about the phrase mutant sighting settled uneasily in his gut. A small warning that had nothing to do with Sylph's calculations and everything to do with instinct built over 7 years of watching things go wrong in the field. "You think we're ready for that?" he asked. Kim hesitated, which from her was answer enough. She wasn't the type to hold back an opinion when she had one. "I think," she said slowly, "that whatever's out there hits harder than a normal cockatrice. And I think if we're going to find out just how strong Sylph actually made you, there's no gentler way to learn it than diving straight into something that's already beaten 2 rank 6 heroes." Neither of them said the rest out loud, but it hung in the space between them anyway. If they walked away from a bounty like this, some smaller guild with less to prove might take it instead, and get hurt far worse than 2 retreating veterans had. Jihan closed his hand slowly around the hilt of his new sword, feeling the faint hum of the grooves against his palm. "Then we take it," he said. Kim looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, already reaching for a pen to accept the contract. Neither of them yet understood exactly what waited in that overgrown clearing to the north, or how much that single decision was about to change. The northern monster area barrier looked different from the one they had trained in. Thicker, somehow, the shimmer along its edge pulsing at irregular intervals, instead of the steady hum Jihan had grown used to. "Barriers reacting to something inside," Kim said quietly, studying the pulse pattern with a frown. "That's not normal for a rank 5 zone." Jihan flexed his grip on the new sword, feeling the faint hum of the alloy settle against his palm. Sylph stirred somewhere beneath his ribs, a restless pressure that hadn't shown up during any of their earlier hunts. "Something's already worried in there," he said. They stepped through together. The overgrowth on the other side was denser than the last MA, vines choking the space between skeletal trees, the air thick with a smell Jihan didn't recognize, sharp and faintly metallic. 2 abandoned supply packs sat near the entrance, tags still attached. The rank 6 team that had fled this place hadn't stopped to collect their gear. "Stay close," Kim murmured. "If this thing dropped 2 ranked heroes, we move as one unit. No splitting up to cover ground." Jihan nodded, already scanning the tree line. The calculation overlay flickered faintly at the corner of his vision, unusually hesitant, cycling through incomplete readouts. Threat class, undetermined. Insufficient data. Sylph had never failed to produce a number before. The first sign of the creature came as a low, dragging shriek somewhere past the tree line, deeper and more guttural than anything a normal cockatrice produced. Kim's hand tightened around her staff. "That's not a normal cry," she said. It broke from the brush a moment later, and Jihan understood immediately why the rank 6 team had abandoned the bounty. The cockatrice was nearly twice the standard size, its feathers a sickly gray rather than the usual mottled brown, veins of dark red pulsing visibly beneath its skin like something diseased. One eye had swollen shut, oozing a black fluid that hissed faintly where it dripped onto the grass. It fixed its remaining eye on them and let out another shriek, and the ground beneath its talons cracked with the force of its charge. Jihan barely had time to register the numbers flashing across his vision, a jumbled mess of danger warnings stacking faster than he could parse, before the mutant closed the distance and swung its beak in a wide arc meant to take his head off. He dropped low on instinct alone, feeling the beak pass close enough to stir his hair, and drove his sword upward into the creature's exposed underside. The blade bit deep, wind gathering along the grooves in a burst of pressure, but the mutant barely staggered. Where a normal cockatrice would have folded instantly, this one simply screamed louder and lashed out with a clawed foot that caught Jihan across the ribs and sent him skidding backward through the underbrush. Pain flared white across his side. He forced himself upright, gasping, the calculation overlay finally stabilizing into something readable. Danger, severe. Recommended action, prioritize evasion. Direct engagement not advised without support. Kim was already moving, chanting fast under her breath, a shield of shimmering light snapping into place around Jihan just as the mutant lunged again. Its beak cracked against the barrier hard enough to send a spiderweb of cracks across the surface, but it held, buying Jihan the half-second he needed to scramble back to his feet. "It's tanking hits that should be dropping it," Kim shouted, her voice tight with strain as she reinforced the shield. "Whatever's wrong with it, it's not fighting like a normal monster." Jihan gritted his teeth, tasting blood where he'd bitten his cheek in the fall. Sylph's presence surged inside him, urgent and insistent, pressing a single instruction into his thoughts more clearly than any calculation ever had. Not the body, the eye. He didn't question it. He circled wide, using haste to put distance between himself and the mutant's next charge, watching for an opening on its blind side. The creature tracked him with its working eye, head twitching in short, unnatural jerks, clearly favoring the side that could still see. Kim's shield cracked further under a second strike, and this time a shard of light splintered off entirely, the barrier thinning dangerously. "Kim, fall back!" Jihan called. "I can hold it a little longer." The mutant surged forward before she finished the sentence, abandoning Jihan entirely to focus its next attack on the smaller, more vulnerable target maintaining the shield. Kim's eyes went wide as the creature's beak drove straight toward her, faster than her spellcasting could redirect. Everything narrowed. Jihan didn't check a single calculation. He simply moved, haste burning through his legs in a blur, closing the gap between himself and Kim faster than he'd ever moved before, and threw himself into the mutant's path a half-second before its beak would have connected. The impact staggered him hard, the beak catching his shoulder instead of Kim's skull, and he felt something crack under the force. But he stayed upright, driven by something that had nothing to do with calculated probability, and drove his sword upward into the creature's swollen, blackened eye with everything Sylph had left to give him. Wind exploded from the point of impact, a concentrated burst that tore through the damaged eye and into the skull behind it. The mutant's shriek cut off mid-cry, its body convulsing once, twice, before collapsing sideways into the underbrush with a heavy, final thud. Silence spread through the clearing, broken only by Jihan's ragged breathing and the soft crackle of Kim's shield dissolving now that the threat had passed. "Jihan!" Kim scrambled to his side, hands hovering uncertainly over his shoulder, clearly unsure where it was safe to touch. "You're bleeding. Your shoulder's definitely broken. Why would you just throw yourself in front of—" "You were the one it wanted," he said simply, wincing as he tested the arm and found it worse than he'd hoped. Wasn't going to let that happen. Kim stared at him, something complicated crossing her face, somewhere between exasperation and an emotion she didn't seem ready to name out loud. She pulled a healing potion from her satchel and pressed it into his good hand without another word of protest, watching closely as the worst of the swelling receded. "You could have died," she said quietly, once his breathing had steadied. "So could you," he answered. "Guess we're even." She didn't laugh at that, not right away, but something in her shoulders loosened, and for a moment the two of them simply sat there, in the ruined clearing, surrounded by the aftermath of something that had nearly ended very differently. It was the mutant's mana crystal that drew the third arrival. Kim was still checking Jihan's shoulder when a low whistle sounded from the tree line, casual and unhurried, entirely at odds with the destruction scattered around the clearing. A wiry man in patched cleanup gear stepped into view, eyeing the mutant's corpse with obvious professional interest. "Well, that's a mess," he said, crouching beside the body without waiting for permission. "Mana crystal on a mutant this size'll fetch a nice price. Mind if I handle disposal? Standard cleanup rate, of course." "Who exactly are you?" Kim asked, still wary, her staff angled subtly between the stranger and Jihan. "Sashimi," the man said, already producing extraction tools from a belt pouch with practice speed. "Monster cleanup specialist. Association registered, mostly. You two look like you earned a bit of a rest after that." Jihan watched him work, noting the slightly too quick movements, the way Sashimi's eyes flicked toward the crystal with more hunger than professional detachment. Something about the man's timing didn't sit right, arriving this fast after a fight this violent, in a monster area this far from the usual cleanup routes. He was proven right within minutes when Sashimi attempted to pocket a second, smaller crystal fragment while pretending to bag the primary sample. "That's not part of the extraction fee," Jihan said flatly, before the man's hand had even fully closed around it. Sashimi froze, then laughed, an easy, unbothered sound that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd been caught. Sharp eyes for someone who just got his shoulder cracked open. Before the moment could sour further, a new voice cut through the clearing, calm and utterly unhurried, carrying an authority that made even Sashimi straighten immediately. Sashimi, put it back. A woman stepped out from the deeper tree line, dressed in simple dark travel gear that did nothing to disguise the sheer presence radiating off her. The ground seemed to still slightly around her footsteps, a faint tremor of earth energy settling in her wake. Sashimi dropped the crystal fragment instantly, all pretense of casual confidence gone. Doha, he muttered. Didn't realize you were tracking this bounty too. I wasn't, Doha said, her attention sliding past him entirely, settling instead on Jihan, with an intensity that made the air feel suddenly heavier. I was tracking the mutant reading. Rank 6 team abandoned it 2 days ago. Association flagged it as a potential Rank 7 escalation. Her gaze dropped to the creature's corpse, then to Jihan's ruined shoulder, then back to his face, calculating something the way a jeweler assesses a stone, before deciding whether it's worth cutting. You dropped this, she said. It wasn't a question. We did, Kim answered, stepping slightly in front of Jihan, despite his size advantage, some instinct urging her to shield him from whatever judgment was coming. Doha's eyes flicked to her, unimpressed, then returned to Jihan. A rank 6 team fled from this thing. You two look barely out of your first month as a pair. She crouched beside the corpse, running 2 fingers along the wound at its blackened eye socket, studying the precision of the strike. This wasn't luck. Wind Elementalist, Sashimi supplied helpfully, still keeping careful distance from Doha. Contracted maybe 2 months back, from what I hear. Something shifted in Doha's expression, subtle but unmistakable, the flicker of genuine interest passing behind otherwise composed eyes. 2 months, she repeated slowly, and already killing what a full rank 6 team couldn't touch. She rose to her full height, studying Jihan the way she'd studied the wound, evaluating rather than admiring. Elementalists don't usually surface for guilds like this one. Her gaze cut briefly to the crude patchwork of Kim's guild insignia. Not unless something interesting happened before the contract formed. Jihan said nothing, unwilling to hand a stranger his history without knowing what she intended to do with it. Doha seemed to expect the silence. She didn't press further, simply turning the fragment of crystal Sashimi had tried to steal over once in her palm before setting it back onto the pile meant for extraction. I'll be watching how far this goes, she said, more to herself than to either of them, before her attention sharpened back onto Jihan, with something almost like challenge. Rank 4 exams are coming up soon. If you're half as capable as this kill suggests, you should consider entering. We just barely survived a mutant fight, Kim said, half laughing, half incredulous. You're talking about the Rank 4 exam already? Doha's expression didn't shift. I'm talking about what I saw in that corpse. Precision like that doesn't come from luck, and it doesn't stay hidden long once other people start noticing it too. She turned to leave, then paused, glancing back once more at Jihan with an unreadable expression that lingered somewhere between curiosity and warning. Heal that shoulder properly, she said. Whatever guild threw you away clearly never taught you how to protect the things that matter most about yourself. She was gone before either of them could respond, disappearing back into the tree line with the same unhurried calm she'd arrived with, leaving behind a clearing full of questions neither Jihan nor Kim had expected to walk away with. Sashimi exhaled slowly once she was well out of earshot. That woman terrifies me more than any mutant ever could. He glanced sideways at Jihan with newfound respect creeping into his expression. You've got Doha Yun personally recommending you for rank 4. Do either of you understand what that actually means? Neither of them did. Not fully, not yet. But something in the way Doha had spoken, calm and precise and utterly certain, settled into Jihan's thoughts and refused to leave. Kiros had spent 7 years convincing him his ceiling was low. This woman had looked at a single kill and immediately started talking about ranks Jihan hadn't even considered reaching yet. Rank 4, Kim repeated slowly, turning the idea over like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit anywhere familiar. That's not a small jump. That's the kind of exam that ends careers before they start. Then we prepare properly, Jihan said, testing his newly healed shoulder with a slow rotation, the ache already fading beneath Sylph's steady presence. We've got time before the next cycle opens. Sashimi, apparently deciding the danger had passed and the profit motive remained intact, finished bagging the primary crystal with considerably more honesty than he'd shown minutes earlier. For what it's worth, he offered, not quite meeting their eyes. Word's going to spread about this fight, regardless of what you decide. Doha doesn't recommend people quietly. He wasn't wrong. By the time Jihan and Kim made it back through the barrier and into the fading evening light of the city, a small crowd of Hero Network notifications had already begun lighting up Kim's registration device. Mentions of an unranked pair dropping a mutant that had defeated seasoned professionals days earlier. Somewhere across the district, in a guild hall Jihan hadn't set foot in for months, that same news would eventually reach ears that had once called him dead weight. He found, walking home with his shoulder finally whole and his new sword humming faintly against his palm, that he was looking forward to that moment more than he expected to. The news reached Kiros 3 days later, carried in through a junior member who'd overheard it secondhand at the association registration office. Mia Lee was the one who brought it to the guild hall, hesitating in the doorway of Guts's office with a look on her face that mixed disbelief with something closer to dread. "That expelled shield," she said carefully. "The one you cut loose, he solo-tanked a mutant cockatrice that beat 2 rank 6 heroes. Do-ha Yoon showed up personally and recommended him for the rank 4 exam. Guts didn't look up from the mission reports scattered across his desk. Impossible. He couldn't land a clean hit in 7 years with us. He's an elementalist now," Mia pressed. "Wind? Contracted the same night we let him go." That got Guts' attention, though not in the direction Mia had hoped. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, something that might have been guilt flickered behind his eyes before hardening into irritation instead. "Lucky timing," he said dismissively. "Doesn't change the years he spent dragging this guild down. If anything, it proves we were right to cut deadweight loose before it became a liability we couldn't afford." Mia didn't argue further, though the doubt didn't leave her expression as she stepped back out of the office. She had noticed things in the weeks since Jihan's expulsion that she hadn't said aloud to anyone. Their strike team took longer clearing standard missions now. 2 members had suffered minor injuries in fights that would have been routine with a proper shield holding the line. Small things, individually forgettable, but stacking up in a way that made the guild's easy confidence feel increasingly hollow. She said nothing about it to Guts. He wasn't the type to hear it even if she tried. Kim Hunai and Sun reacted with less restraint when the news eventually reached them over drinks that evening, the details growing more exaggerated with each retelling as it passed through the guild's lower ranks. "No way that's the same guy," Sun said flatly, staring at his glass like it might contain a better explanation than the one being offered. "He couldn't even land a hit in sparring matches. Doesn't matter what he couldn't do before," Kim Hunai muttered, though his tone lacked its usual confidence. "Point is, he's someone else's problem now, not ours." Neither of them said what actually sat uncomfortably beneath the conversation, the quiet, nagging thought that the man they'd humiliated and discarded might be climbing faster than either of them ever had. Back at the storage unit that served as Epic Guild's headquarters, Kim had already pulled up everything the public registry offered on Rank 4 examination requirements, spreading printed sheets across the workbench with the intensity of someone preparing for a war rather than a test. Physical combat evaluation, tactical assessment, then a formal interview with a review panel, she read aloud, tracing a finger down the requirements list. The combat portion alone eliminates most candidates. They don't hold back on evaluators. "How bad is bad?" Jihan asked, settling onto the stool across from her, still adjusting to the lighter weight of his healed shoulder. "Depends on the cycle," Kim said. "Sometimes it's straightforward. Sometimes the association brings in someone specifically to weed out anyone who isn't genuinely ready." She hesitated, scanning further down the sheet. "This cycle's evaluator hasn't been announced yet. Could be anyone." Jihan thought of Do-ha's parting words, the casual certainty in her voice when she'd told him to consider entering, as if she already expected him to pass regardless of who stood across from him. "We prepare like it's the hardest evaluator they've ever assigned," he said. "If it turns out easier, that's a pleasant surprise. If it doesn't, we're not caught unprepared." Kim smiled slightly at that, the exhausted, satisfied smile of someone finally working with a partner who matched her intensity instead of needing to be dragged along by it. 2 months at Kiros to unlearn 7 years of bad habits, she said, half to herself, gathering the training sheets into a neater stack. "And somehow, you're already talking like someone who's been doing this far longer. Maybe some things you always knew how to do," Jihan said quietly. "Nobody ever gave you the chance to prove it." They began training the next morning before dawn, Kim pushing him through drills designed less around raw combat and more around the kind of tactical thinking the exam panel would be watching for: reaction speed, resource management, adapting mid-fight when the calculation overlay offered incomplete information, the way it had against the mutant. Sylph's presence grew steadier with each session, less like a separate voice guiding him and more like an extension of his own instincts, the boundary between the spirit's guidance and his own judgment blurring in a way that felt less unsettling with every passing day. Somewhere across the district, Kiros continued running missions with a hole in their formation nobody wanted to name aloud. And somewhere in a guild hall built from ambition rather than desperation, Jihan trained toward an exam that would soon force every guild in the city, including the one that had thrown him away, to reckon with exactly what they'd lost. The exam cycle opened faster than either of them expected, the official notice arriving barely 2 weeks into their training, far shorter a window than Kim had hoped for. "They moved the schedule up," she said, reading the notice twice, as if the date might change on a second look. "Something about evaluator availability. We've got 12 days. 12 days is what we've got," Jihan said. "So that's what we use." They spent those final days sharpening everything Sylph had taught him, running drills late into the night until Kim's hands shook from exhaustion, and Jihan's mana reserves dipped low enough that the calculation overlay began flickering with warnings of its own. Neither of them slowed down. Both understood, without needing to say it aloud, exactly how much this exam meant for a guild that had spent 8 months surviving on scraps. Word of the evaluator's identity finally reached them the night before the exam, delivered by a runner from the association with a look of poorly concealed sympathy. "Xiangbang," the runner said, "elite swordsman, rank 2 himself. He's evaluating personally this cycle." Kim went pale. "That's not a name they usually send for a rank 4 intake exam. That's a name they send when they want to remind everyone how far the gap actually is." Jihan turned the sword over in his hands, feeling the faint hum of the alloy against his palm, thinking of Doha's parting words in the ruined clearing where the mutant had fallen. "Whatever guild threw you away clearly never taught you how to protect the things that matter most about yourself." He intended to prove, in front of an evaluator feared across every guild in the city, that whatever Kiros had failed to see in him for 7 years, someone else finally had. "Then tomorrow," he said quietly, "we show him exactly what he's underestimating." The examination grounds sat inside a reinforced arena on the association's central campus. Tiered stone seating rising around a wide circular floor marked with faint runic lines that pulsed a dull blue whenever a candidate stepped onto them. Jihan had never set foot inside a space built specifically to test a hero's worth. Kiros had never trusted him with anything that mattered enough to test. Rows of candidates waited along the arena's edge, most in guild colors far more established than Epic's plain gray. A few glanced at Jihan and Kim with open curiosity, word of the mutant kill clearly having spread further than either of them realized. Others didn't bother looking at all, dismissing the pair as unranked nobodies who'd wandered in over their heads. Xiangbang entered without ceremony, a lean man in his 30s with a sword sheathed loosely at his hip and an expression that suggested profound boredom with everything happening around him. He surveyed the assembled candidates once, said nothing, then gestured for the first pair to step forward. The examinations that followed set an immediate tone. Xiangbang dismantled every team with almost insulting efficiency, disarming candidates in seconds, occasionally not even bothering to draw his blade fully from its sheath before ending an exchange. 2 teams withdrew entirely after watching the first 3 evaluations, unwilling to risk the humiliation. "He's not testing skill," Kim murmured, watching the 4th pair get eliminated in under 10 seconds. "He's testing whether people know when they're beaten. Half these teams are folding out of fear before he even engages properly." "Then we don't fold," Jihan said. When their names were called, a ripple of quiet interest passed through the seated crowd, the mutant kill rumor finally connecting a name to a face. Jihan felt the weight of dozens of unfamiliar eyes settle on him as he and Kim stepped onto the marked floor. Xiangbang studied them both for a long moment, gaze lingering slightly longer on Jihan than it had on any previous candidate. "Wind Elementalist," he said, more statement than question. "Interesting. Most Elementalists skip straight to rank 5 intake. You're taking the harder road." "We didn't have the guild backing for a shortcut," Kim answered honestly, earning a faint, almost approving nod from the evaluator. "Begin when ready," Xiangbang said, drawing his sword in a single unhurried motion. The calculation overlay flared to life the instant he moved, numbers scrolling faster than Jihan had ever seen them, danger warnings stacking on top of each other in rapid succession. Threat class, severe. Success probability, low without coordination. Xiangbang closed the distance in a blur, faster than the mutant cockatrice, faster than anything Jihan had trained against. He barely got his sword up in time to deflect the first strike, the impact rattling up through his arm hard enough to numb his fingers. Kim moved simultaneously, casting a rapid succession of illusion spells that split her image into 3 overlapping afterimages, forcing Xiangbang to hesitate for a fraction of a second while his blade cut through empty air where one image dissolved. That fraction of a second was all Jihan needed. Sylph surged through him, haste flooding his legs, and he closed the gap while Xiangbang's guard was still resetting from the feint. His sword found the evaluator's shoulder, not a killing blow, not even close to one, but a clean touch that in a real fight would have opened a serious wound. Xiangbang stepped back, genuine surprise flickering across his face, an expression the earlier candidates had never once managed to draw out of him. "That's a real hit," he said, almost to himself. He rolled his shoulder once, testing the spot where Jihan's blade had connected, then settled back into a ready stance, with considerably more focus than he'd shown against any previous candidate. Let's see if it was luck. The second exchange moved faster than Jihan could consciously track, his body responding to calculations flashing at speeds his mind could barely register, Sylph's presence guiding each motion with an urgency that bordered on desperate. Xiangbang's blade found him twice, shallow cuts across his forearm and thigh that stung fiercely but didn't slow him, each wound a cost paid willingly against an opponent this far beyond his own skill level. Kim's magic proved far more sophisticated than either of them had shown in training. A binding spell wrapped briefly around Xiangbang's ankle, forcing him to break stride mid-strike, and in that single stumbled half-step, Jihan saw an opening the calculation overlay flagged with rare, unhesitating clarity. Optimal window. Execute now. He drove forward, channeling everything Sylph could offer into a single focused strike, wind gathering along the alloy blade in a compressed, humming edge. Xiangbang recovered just enough to parry, but the force of the impact drove him back 3 full steps, boots scraping against the stone floor. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The crowd had gone entirely silent, the earlier restless murmur replaced by something closer to disbelief. Xiangbang lowered his sword slowly, studying Jihan with an expression that had shed every trace of boredom. "You've had that class 2, maybe 3 months," he said. "It wasn't quite a question, and you're fighting like you've studied blade work for years before it." "I was a shield for 7 years," Jihan answered, still catching his breath, blood dripping steadily from the cut across his forearm. "Learned how to read an opponent's weight before I ever learned how to hit one." Something shifted in Xiangbang's expression at that, an understanding passing behind his eyes that had nothing to do with combat technique and everything to do with recognizing a particular kind of hard-earned instinct. "Pass," he said simply, sheathing his sword. "Both of you. I don't need to see more." Kim let out a breath she'd clearly been holding since the exam began, relief washing visibly across her face. Jihan allowed himself only a brief moment of satisfaction before the ache in his forearm reminded him the fight had cost something real. Xiangbang lingered a moment longer than protocol required, his gaze settling on Jihan with something almost like curiosity. "Whoever discarded you," he said quietly, low enough that only Jihan and Kim could hear it, "made a mistake they're going to spend a long time regretting." He walked off without waiting for a response, leaving Jihan standing on the marked floor with his wounds still fresh and a strange, unfamiliar warmth settling somewhere beneath his ribs that had nothing to do with Sylph's magic. The interview panel convened 3 days later in a smaller chamber adjoining the arena. 4 association officials seated behind a long table stacked with evaluation reports. Kim had warned him the interview portion mattered nearly as much as the combat test, a chance for the panel to assess character, guild stability, and long-term potential before granting the promotion officially. She had not warned him how openly hostile one particular panelist could be. The man, an older official with a permanently sour expression, barely glanced at Jihan's combat scores before turning his full attention on Kim. "Epic Guild," he said, tone dripping with condescension. "Formed 8 months ago. 2 members total, until recently. No notable client contracts, no established reputation." He flipped through her guild's paperwork with visible disdain. "Frankly, I'm surprised the association let a guild this small sponsor a rank 4 candidate at all. My guild's size doesn't reflect the quality of the work we've done," Kim said, her voice tight but steady. "Doesn't it?" the official pressed. "A guild leader who can barely field 2 fighters, sponsoring an elementalist she recruited off the street 2 months ago. Forgive me if that sounds less like sound leadership and more like desperate opportunism. Kim's jaw tightened, color rising in her cheeks, but she said nothing further, clearly trying to hold her composure under an attack she hadn't fully prepared for. Jihan felt something harden in his chest, a familiar, quiet fury he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the night Kiros expelled him. "With respect," he said, cutting into the silence before the official could continue. "I spent 7 years at a guild with plenty of established reputation and client contracts. They also spent 7 years treating me like disposable equipment before discarding me the moment I stopped being convenient." The room went still. Kim turned to look at him, startled. "Kim recruited me the same week I was thrown out with nothing," Jihan continued, holding the official's gaze steadily. "She offered fair terms, real investment, and actual respect before I'd proven a single thing to her. If that's desperate opportunism, then every guild in this city should be so desperate." The official's expression soured further, clearly unaccustomed to a candidate speaking so directly against a panel member. "Careful with your tone." "I'm being accurate," Jihan said evenly. "You're welcome to question her guild's size. You don't get to question her character in front of me and expect silence." A long, uncomfortable pause settled over the room. One of the other panelists, a younger woman who'd remained quiet throughout the exchange, exchanged a brief glance with her colleague, something like approval flickering across her expression before she smoothed it back into professional neutrality. The sour-faced official cleared his throat, clearly searching for a way to reassert control over an interview that had slipped sideways. "Regardless of sentiment, the panel's decision rests on merit alone." "Then evaluate the merit," Jihan said. "Combat scores speak for themselves." Guild leadership speaks for itself too, if you're willing to actually look at it instead of the size of the roster. The interview limped forward through several more pointed questions, though the official's earlier hostility never fully returned, tempered by something that might have been grudging respect or simple unwillingness to provoke another direct confrontation. When the panel finally excused them to deliberate, Kim exhaled shakily the moment they were alone in the corridor outside. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," Jihan answered. "Nobody stood up for me for 7 years. I wasn't about to sit there and let someone talk down to you the same way." Kim looked at him for a long moment, something complicated and warm passing across her expression, before she managed a small, unsteady smile. "Nobody's ever defended me like that before," she admitted. "Not from anyone, let alone an association official." "Then it was overdue," Jihan said simply. The panel's decision came through less than an hour later, delivered by the same younger official who'd shown quiet approval during the interview. Epic Guild had passed. Both members promoted to rank 4, effective immediately. Kim's composure finally broke entirely, a wide, disbelieving grin spreading across her face as she read the official notice twice over. "We did it. Actually did it. Rank 4, Jihan." Word reached Kiros within the day, delivered this time by an association clerk, processing routine rank updates across the district's guild registry. Junga Park, Kiros's owner, read the notification twice, with visibly mounting disbelief. "Doha Yun personally recommended him," the clerk added, almost as an afterthought. "And he passed Xiang Bang's combat evaluation without a single point deduction, rare enough that the panel noted it separately." Junga set the notice down slowly, staring at nothing in particular for a long moment. Whatever assumptions Kiros had built about the man they'd discarded were beginning, quietly and irreversibly, to crack. Back at the storage unit that had somehow started feeling like home, Jihan sat across from Kim as she poured them both something to celebrate with, her earlier exhaustion replaced entirely by giddy, restless energy. "Rank 4 missions open up an entirely new tier of contracts," she said, already scrolling through the guild network on her registration device. "Better pay, better reputation, better everything. This changes what Epic can actually become." Jihan turned his sword over slowly in the lamplight, feeling the faint hum of the alloy beneath his fingers, thinking of Guts standing over him in that monster area months ago, calling him dead weight while his shoulder still bled from every hit he'd taken protecting people who never once considered protecting him back. They had built their entire judgment of him around 7 years of watching him absorb damage silently. They had never once imagined what happened when someone finally gave him a reason to fight back. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. Kim glanced up at him, something steady and certain settling into her expression. "Yeah," she agreed. I think it really is. Their first rank 4 mission came less than a week later, a routine escort assignment through the Eastern Commercial District, and it was there that Jihan got his first real look at how differently the city treated heroes once rumors of monster hunting reached ordinary people who'd never set foot inside a barrier. A crowd had gathered near the mission checkpoint, dozens of protesters holding signs painted with slogans, condemning what they called the exploitation of captured monsters for guild profit. Their chants grew louder as Epic's small transport vehicle approached, several protesters moving to physically block the checkpoint gate. Monster rights demonstration, Kim muttered, eyeing the crowd warily. Third one this month, according to the guild network. They think guilds are farming lesser monsters for mana crystals instead of clearing genuine threats. Are they wrong? Jihan asked, watching a young woman near the front of the crowd hold her sign higher, her expression fierce and unwavering. Kim hesitated. Sometimes, not always. There've been a few ugly cases of guilds baiting weaker monsters just to farm crystals instead of actually protecting anyone. Doesn't mean every guild does it, but it's not pure fiction either. Before either of them could decide how to proceed, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd's edge, moving with the same unhurried calm that had first announced her presence in the ruined clearing months earlier. Doha walked directly toward the checkpoint gate, and the protesters, despite their earlier determination, parted almost instinctively to let her through. "You're blocking an authorized checkpoint," Doha said, her voice carrying without needing to be raised. "I understand your grievance. I don't understand why you think physically obstructing an escort mission accomplishes anything toward it." The young woman with the sign stepped forward, jaw set with obvious determination. "Guilds like yours don't care what happens to the monsters caught in the middle. You just care about the crystals and the paycheck." "Some guilds don't care," Doha agreed evenly. "That doesn't describe every guild, and it certainly doesn't describe the mission scheduled through this checkpoint today. Standing in front of it doesn't punish the guilds you're actually angry at. It only delays people trying to do their jobs properly." Something in her tone, calm and utterly without malice, seemed to deflate the crowd's earlier momentum more effectively than any show of force could have. The protesters lowered their signs slightly, murmuring among themselves, and within minutes, the checkpoint cleared without further incident. Doha turned to find Jihan and Kim watching the exchange from beside their transport, and something like recognition crossed her face. "Rank 4 already," she observed, studying the fresh insignia on Jihan's jacket. "Faster than I expected, though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised anymore." "Your recommendation helped," Jihan said. "Thank you." Doha waved the gratitude off with mild impatience. "I recommended what I saw. The rest was yours." She studied him a moment longer, something calculating behind her expression. "You've made quite an impression in a short span of time. I'd like you to see something if you're willing to spare an afternoon." Kim glanced at Jihan, clearly curious despite the mission schedule waiting on them. "See what exactly?" "Dice Guild headquarters," Doha said simply. "It's time you understood what a serious operation actually looks like, now that you're stepping into ranks that matter." The offer carried weight neither of them fully understood yet, but something in the way Doha delivered it, calm and deliberate, made it clear this wasn't a casual invitation extended lightly. They completed their escort mission first, delivering the scheduled cargo without further disruption, before making their way across the city toward the address Doha had provided. Dice Guild's headquarters occupied an entire converted office tower near the district's financial center, a stark contrast to the cramped storage unit Epic still called home. Uniformed guild staff moved briskly through a lobby lined with framed commendations and mission records stretching back years, each one representing contracts and achievements Epic had barely begun to imagine reaching. Kim's eyes widened slightly, taking in the scale of an operation that dwarfed anything she'd built in 8 months of relentless effort. Doha led them past the lobby and into an upper-floor meeting room where a woman Jihan didn't recognize waited. Seated at a long table covered in mission reports and regional maps marked with colored pins across half the city. "This is Jihan Yu, and his guild leader Kim," Doha said, gesturing toward them. "Newly promoted rank 4. I mentioned them to you last week." The woman rose smoothly, studying Jihan with an appraising expression that reminded him uncomfortably of the way Doha herself had first assessed him in that ruined clearing. "So this is the wind elementalist everyone's talking about," she said, extending a hand with practiced ease. "I've heard quite a bit. I'm looking forward to seeing whether the rumors hold up." Jihan shook her hand, uncertain exactly what role she played within Dice Guild's operation, or why Doha had considered this introduction important enough to arrange personally. "Sit," the woman said, gesturing toward the chairs across from her cluttered table. "I don't often get the chance to meet someone this early in their career who's already generating this much attention. Doha doesn't extend invitations casually, so I'd rather not waste the opportunity on small talk." Kim lowered herself into a chair with visible caution, glancing between the woman and Doha as if trying to piece together an unspoken hierarchy neither of them had bothered explaining. "You run operations here?" Kim asked carefully. "Among other things," the woman answered, her tone giving little away. "Dice Guild handles considerably more than standard monster hunting contracts. Regional coordination, intelligence gathering on emerging threats, occasional work directly with the association on matters that don't make it into public mission listings." She tapped one of the colored pins on the map spread across her table, indicating a cluster near the district's northern edge. "The mutant cockatrice you two handled, for instance. That reading wasn't random. We'd been tracking anomalous mana fluctuations in that zone for weeks before it escalated." Jihan felt something shift uneasily in his chest. "You knew something was building there before we walked in." "We suspected," the woman corrected. "Suspicion and certainty aren't the same thing, and by the time we confirmed it, the situation had already outpaced our available resources in that sector. Doha's team happened to be the closest asset when it escalated past containment." "That could have gotten us killed," Kim said, an edge entering her voice despite her earlier caution. "It could have," the woman agreed, without apology or excessive concern. "Most first contracts at your rank carry some version of that risk, whether anyone tells you so directly or not. The difference is that you both survived it, and did so well enough to draw serious attention. That's precisely why you're sitting here now instead of reading about this conversation secondhand." Doha, who had remained quiet through most of the exchange, finally spoke again, her tone measured. "The kind of work Dice Guild handles requires people capable of operating under exactly that kind of uncertainty. I don't extend recommendations to just anyone who passes a standard exam. I extend them to people I think can handle what comes after." Jihan absorbed that slowly, turning the implication over in his mind. This wasn't simply a tour, and it wasn't simply an introduction. Doha was positioning him, deliberately and with clear intent, towards something considerably larger than Epic Guild's modest ambitions had ever accounted for. "What exactly are you offering?" Jihan asked directly. "And what would it cost Epic if I accepted it?" The woman's expression shifted slightly, something like approval passing behind her otherwise unreadable gaze. "Direct. I appreciate that, in someone this early in their career." She leaned back in her chair, studying him with renewed interest. "I'm not offering anything yet. I'm evaluating whether it's worth the conversation at all. Today was simply the introduction." She rose from the table, gathering a folder of reports, before glancing once more between Jihan and Kim. "There's considerably more happening in this city than routine monster hunts and rank 4 examinations," she said. "Political friction between the larger guilds, territorial disputes over resource-rich monster areas, concerns about certain established guilds cutting corners in ways that eventually get people killed." Her gaze lingered pointedly on Jihan for a moment longer than the rest of the statement required. "Given your history, I suspect some of what's coming will interest you more than you'd initially expect." She left the details there, deliberately unfinished, and Jihan understood, watching her exit the room with the same unhurried authority Doha carried, that whatever conversation had just begun was far from over. Kim let out a slow breath once the door closed behind her, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know whether to be excited or terrified." "Maybe both," Jihan said quietly, still turning over everything the woman had left unspoken. 7 years at Kiros. I never once wondered what existed above the missions right in front of me. I'm starting to think that was smaller thinking than I realized." Doha studied him for a long moment, something unreadable settling behind her expression. "Welcome," she said simply, "to the part of hero work nobody explains during registration." The weeks after the Dice Guild visit passed in a blur of missions, each one carrying weight the earlier Rank 5 contracts never had. A saber-tooth infestation near the southern quarry became Epic's first true Rank 4 assignment. 3 of the massive cats prowling a construction site after breaking loose from a collapsed containment barrier. Jihan handled the lead beast alone, while Kim managed the other 2 with a combination of binding spells and precise illusion work that left the site foreman openly stunned by how quickly the situation resolved. 2 people, the foreman muttered, watching the last saber-tooth collapse under a compressed wind cutter. The last team the association sent for something like this needed 6. Word of that contract spread the same way the mutant cockatrice story had. Quietly at first, then faster once other guilds began comparing notes. Epic's reputation, barely a rumor 2 months earlier, was beginning to solidify into something guilds could no longer dismiss outright. Sashimi reappeared during their 3rd Rank 4 mission, showing up at the cleanup stage of a routine extraction with considerably more professionalism than his first introduction had suggested he possessed. "Figured I'd get ahead of the competition," he said, already sorting salvageable materials with practiced efficiency. "Word's out that whatever guild you two build a reputation with tends to end up busy. Better to be the cleanup specialist they already trust than the one they're still deciding whether to hire." Kim eyed him warily, still remembering the attempted theft from their first encounter. "You tried to steal from us." "Once," Sashimi admitted, unbothered. "Learned my lesson pretty thoroughly when Do-ha-yoon showed up personally to correct me. Figured the smarter long-term play was making myself useful instead of memorable for the wrong reasons." He proved surprisingly reliable over the following weeks, arriving promptly for extraction work, flagging valuable materials Kim's inexperienced eye would have missed, and gradually becoming a fixture at the edges of Epic's growing operation, despite neither Jihan nor Kim ever formally hiring him. "He's useful," Jihan admitted one evening, watching Sashimi carefully bag a batch of mana crystal fragments without a single attempt at skimming. "Annoying, but useful. Everyone we've picked up so far has started somewhere complicated," Kim said, glancing sideways at Jihan with a faint, knowing smile. "Seems to be a pattern with this guild." Meanwhile, across the district, Kiros's decline continued in ways nobody there could bring themselves to acknowledge openly. Seon Lim found herself, more often than she wanted to admit, catching herself mid-mission reaching for support that no longer existed. During a routine clearance job that turned unexpectedly dangerous, she braced for the familiar solidity of a shield absorbing the worst of an incoming strike, only to remember, half a second too late, that the person who used to provide it was gone. She took the hit meant for someone else instead, a shallow wound across her side that healed easily enough, but the moment lodged itself uncomfortably in her thoughts for days afterward. "We used to move faster than this," she said quietly to another Kiros member during a post-mission debrief, neither of them looking directly at Guts as he reviewed the contract's outcome with visible frustration. "Nobody talks about it, but we all feel it." The other member said nothing, though the tightness around their eyes suggested agreement they weren't willing to voice aloud where Guts might hear it. Guts himself grew increasingly short-tempered as reports of Epic Guild's rising reputation filtered back through the district's guild network, each mention landing like a small, unwelcome reminder of a decision he refused to reconsider. "He got lucky," he said dismissively, "more than once, whenever Jihan's name surfaced in conversation. An elemental contract doesn't erase 7 years of being useless in a real fight." But the numbers told a different story than his stubbornness allowed him to admit. Kiros's mission completion times had slowed noticeably since Jihan's departure. Minor injuries among the strike team had become more frequent, small enough individually to dismiss, significant enough collectively that even outside observers began noticing the pattern. Word of it reached an old acquaintance of Jihan's, a scarred veteran hero known simply as Scarface within certain circles, who had crossed paths with him years earlier during a joint operation neither guild had bothered documenting properly. "Kiros's shield," Scarface said to a group of younger heroes at a guild social gathering, upon hearing Jihan's name mentioned dismissively by someone repeating Guts' narrative secondhand. "I remember him. Held a collapsing containment line alone for almost 10 minutes during a joint operation years back, long enough for the rest of us to get civilians clear. Kiros never once put his name on the after-action report. Convenient, considering how they're describing him now." The comment spread quickly through circles that had never met Jihan personally, quietly undermining the narrative Kiros had built around his expulsion, one conversation at a time. None of it reached Jihan directly, not at first. He learned of it only later, secondhand, through Kim's growing network of contacts across the guild community. And when he did, he felt something settle in his chest that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite relief, but sat somewhere close to both. "People remembered," he said quietly, turning the information over. "Even after everything Kiros said about me. People who actually worked alongside you," Kim corrected gently. "The ones who watched you carry weight instead of just hearing about it secondhand." The activist tension around monster hunting hadn't fully resolved either. resurfacing weeks later in a larger, more organized demonstration near the association's central registration office, drawing enough attention that several guild leaders, including representatives from Dice Guild, arrived to monitor the situation directly. Doha found Jihan and Kim near the edge of the gathering crowd, her expression carrying a weight it hadn't held during their earlier encounter. "This one's different," she said quietly, studying the assembled protesters with unusual focus. "Larger organization behind it this time. Someone's coordinating these demonstrations more deliberately than a handful of concerned citizens usually manage on their own." "You think someone's using the protests for something else?" Jihan said, following her gaze toward a small cluster of organizers near the front, deep in quiet, focused conversation. "I think," Doha said carefully, "that legitimate grievances make excellent cover for people with entirely different motives. Whether that's happening here specifically, I haven't confirmed yet." Her attention shifted back to Jihan, something calculating settling behind her eyes. Which is precisely the kind of situation Dice Guild exists to look into properly, rather than leaving it to guilds that would rather ignore the complexity entirely. She didn't elaborate further, though the implication hung clearly in the space between them, another thread in the same larger pattern she'd hinted at during their first visit to Dice Guild headquarters. The demonstration dispersed without serious incident, Doha's calm presence once again diffusing tension that could easily have spiraled into something worse. But the unresolved questions she'd raised lingered long after the crowd cleared, settling into Jihan's thoughts alongside everything else building steadily around him. Epic Guild's growth hadn't gone unnoticed by the association either. A formal notice arrived less than a week later, inviting Kim to a preliminary consultation regarding expanded guild certification, a status reserved for operations demonstrating consistent capability well beyond their official rank. "This isn't normal," Kim said, reading the notice 3 times over, her earlier disbelief at their rank 4 promotion resurfacing in a new, more intense form. "Guilds our age don't get considered for expanded certification, not without years of an established track record first." "Maybe we're building that track record faster than most guilds manage," Jihan said. Kim looked at him for a long moment, something settling into her expression that mixed pride with a faint, nervous uncertainty about exactly how large Epic was becoming in such a short span of time. 2 months ago, I was running this guild alone out of a storage unit," she said quietly. "Now Doha Yun is personally introducing us to Dice Guild leadership, and the association's asking about expanded certification." She let out a slow breath. "It's a lot, Jihan." "It is," he agreed. "But it's the kind of a lot that comes from actually being seen properly. Finally, after 7 years of being overlooked." The consultation itself took place 3 days later in a modest association office far less imposing than either the exam arena or Dice Guild's converted tower, a single administrator reviewing Epic's mission logs with careful, methodical attention rather than the theatrical hostility Jihan had braced himself for. "Expanded certification isn't a formality," the administrator explained, sliding a thick folder of requirements across the desk. "It comes with additional oversight, additional expectations, and considerably more visibility. Guilds under this status get assigned to situations regular rank 4 contracts wouldn't touch. Regional coordination work, sensitive extractions. Occasionally, matters the association would rather not broadcast on the public mission board." "Why offer it to us this early?" Kim asked. "We've barely had 2 months as a certified pair." "Because capability doesn't wait for guilds to reach a convenient age before it becomes obvious," the administrator said simply. "We've reviewed your mutant cockatrice engagement, your rank 4 combat evaluation, and the Eastern District escort assignment. Individually, any one of those might be dismissed as an anomaly. Together, they describe a pattern the association doesn't like leaving unaccounted for." He set a formal application across the desk, along with a secondary document bearing Dice Guild's official seal. "You'll notice this recommendation," he added, tapping the second document. "Doha Yun rarely submits these. When she does, the association tends to move quickly." Kim stared at the seal for a long moment before glancing sideways at Jihan, something unspoken passing between them. Neither of them had expected the conversation to move this fast, or for Doha's quiet interest to translate into something this concrete this soon. They left the consultation with the application in hand, walking back through the district in a comfortable, contemplative silence neither felt the need to immediately fill with words. "You ever think about how strange this is?" Kim said eventually, as they crossed a familiar intersection near the storage unit. 4 months ago, you were being expelled from a guild that spent 7 years treating you like furniture. Now the association's fast-tracking us because a top-ranked hero personally vouched for you. I think about it constantly, Jihan admitted. Mostly I think about how none of this happened because Kiros was wrong about effort. I gave them everything I had for 7 years. They just never once bothered looking closely enough to see what that effort was actually worth. Their loss, Kim said simply. Genuinely. Their loss, and our gain, and I don't feel even slightly guilty saying that out loud. So Lafor. Back at the storage unit, the application sat on the workbench between them for the rest of the evening. Neither of them quite ready to sign it immediately, despite how clearly the answer had already settled in both their minds. Once we sign this, Kim said, tracing a finger along the formal seal, there's no quiet version of Epic Guild left. We'll be visible in ways we've never had to manage before. Bigger targets, bigger expectations, bigger scrutiny if anything goes wrong. We've been visible since the mutant fight, Jihan pointed out. This just makes it official. Kim laughed softly, some of the earlier tension draining out of her shoulders. Fair point. She picked up a pen, studying the signature line for one last moment, before finally pressing it to the page. For Epic, she murmured, more to herself than to him, finishing the signature with a decisive stroke. Jihan added his own signature beneath hers, the weight of the moment settling somewhere quiet and certain in his chest, entirely unlike the numb disbelief that had followed his expulsion months earlier. That night had ended one version of his life without warning or ceremony, tossed aside in an envelope of severance pay. This moment, deliberate and chosen, felt like the opposite entirely, a door opening rather than one slamming shut behind him. That evening, as Kim drafted her response to the association's consultation invitation, Jihan sat by the storage unit's cracked window, watching the district lights flicker on as dusk settled over the city, turning the sword Sylph had helped shape over slowly in his hands. Somewhere across the city, Kiros continued pretending nothing had changed, clinging to a version of events that grew harder to sustain with every passing week. Somewhere else, Doha and Dice Guild were quietly investigating currents running beneath the surface of ordinary guild business, currents that Jihan sensed, without fully understanding yet, were about to pull him and Kim into something considerably larger than either of them had ever prepared for. He thought of Guts, standing over him in that monster area months ago, certain that discarding a loyal shield carried no real cost. He thought of Sylph's first touch against his skin, cool and patient, choosing him at the exact moment everyone else had decided he was worthless. He thought of Kim, offering him a contract before he'd proven anything, and of Doha, watching him rise through ranks faster than she'd expected, and of a woman at Dice Guild headquarters who'd made it clear, without saying so directly, that Jihan's story was far from finished. 7 years of being called deadweight had ended with an envelope of severance money and a night alone on a curb with nothing left to his name. What came after that night, Kiros had never once bothered to imagine. Guts still refused to acknowledge it openly, dismissing every fresh rumor with the same tired insistence that luck alone explained an elemental contract, a rank 4 promotion, and a personal recommendation from one of the strongest heroes in the region. But the strain was showing in smaller ways now, in the guild's slower mission times, in the growing hesitance of members who no longer trusted the formation to hold the way it used to, in the quiet, unspoken understanding, spreading through Kiros's lower ranks, that something essential had walked out the door the night they'd expelled their shield. Mia Lee, more than anyone else, carried that understanding closest to the surface. She hadn't apologized, she hadn't approached Jihan directly, hadn't sent a message, hadn't done anything that might constitute an admission of what she suspected was true. But she'd started watching the Guild Network's public updates on Epic's contracts with an attention she couldn't quite explain to herself, some quiet, unresolved part of her, waiting for a reckoning she sensed was still owed, even if nobody at Kiros was ready to name it directly. That reckoning hadn't arrived yet, not fully. Guts' stubbornness remained intact. Kim Hunai and Sun continued pretending indifference whenever Jihan's name surfaced in conversation. Junga Park's growing unease hadn't translated into any public acknowledgement of the guild's mistake, but it came closer than any of them expected during a joint operation the following week, one of the rare occasions where the association assigned 2 guilds to the same containment perimeter due to the scale of the threat involved. Kiros drew the northern flank. Epic, still adjusting to their expanded workload, drew the southern. Mia recognized Jihan across the containment line almost immediately, and something in her chest tightened at the sight of him standing easily beside Kim, sword humming faintly at his side, radiating none of the quiet uncertainty that had defined him during his final months at Kiros. "You look different," she said, when their paths crossed briefly near the coordination checkpoint, unable to help the words slipping out before she'd properly considered them. "I am different," Jihan answered. Not unkindly, though there was no warmth in it either. "Turns out I had a lot more in me than 7 years at Kiros ever gave me room to show." Mia opened her mouth, then closed it again, uncertain exactly what she wanted to say, or whether anything she said now could matter after everything that had already happened. "I should have said something," she admitted finally, quietly, glancing back toward the rest of her team assembling near the northern perimeter. "During the boss fight, afterward, I should have said something, and I didn't, and I've thought about that more than I probably should since you left." Jihan studied her for a long moment, weighing the admission against 4 months of silence that had followed his expulsion. "You're the only one who said anything close to that," he said eventually. "I don't know what to do with it yet, but I heard it." He turned back toward Kim before Mia could respond further, leaving her standing alone near the checkpoint, with an apology only half delivered, and a reckoning that remained, for now, unfinished. The containment operation itself proceeded smoothly enough, both guilds handling their respective flanks without serious incident, though observers along the perimeter couldn't help noticing the marked difference in coordination between the two teams. Kiros moved with the strained, overcautious rhythm of a formation missing a piece it had never properly replaced. Epic moved like two people who trusted each other completely, filling gaps in each other's approach before either of them needed to ask. Doha arrived near the operation's conclusion, ostensibly to review containment reports for Dice Guild's records, though her attention lingered noticeably on the contrast between the two guilds working the same perimeter. "Interesting," she said quietly to Jihan, once the site had been cleared and both teams began packing equipment for departure. "Watching a guild fracture from the outside is always more informative than reading about it secondhand." "You think Kiros is fracturing," Jihan said. "I think guilds built on convenience rather than genuine investment eventually show cracks whenever the convenience runs out," Doha said. "Yours didn't run out. It simply left, and took something essential with it that they never bothered valuing while it was still in front of them." She studied him a moment longer, something almost gentle passing behind her usually composed expression. "For what it's worth," she added, "the woman at Dice Guild headquarters mentioned you again this week. She doesn't do that without reason." Jihan absorbed that quietly, uncertain exactly what it meant for Epic's future, or how much longer their modest guild would remain modest, given the attention steadily accumulating around them. That night, back at the storage unit, Kim found him still turning the day's events over in his mind, staring absently at the cracked window overlooking the district. "You're thinking about Mia," she said, settling onto the stool across from him. "A little," he admitted. "Mostly I'm thinking about how strange it is, watching the thing that broke you slowly break itself instead, and not feeling the satisfaction I expected to feel." "Maybe that's not weakness," Kim said gently. "Maybe it just means you've already moved past needing their collapse to feel like you've won." Jihan considered that for a long moment, turning the sword over slowly in the lamplight, feeling Sylph's steady presence settle beneath his ribs the way it always did now, familiar rather than foreign. "Maybe," he agreed quietly. Kim leaned back, studying him with the same steady attention she'd shown since the night she'd first offered him a contract on nothing but instinct and a registration alert. "Whatever Doha and Dice Guild are building toward, whatever this expanded certification actually turns into, I think we're ready for it. Both of us." "I think so too," Jihan said. Outside, the district lights continued their slow climb against the darkening sky, and somewhere beyond the storage unit's cracked window, an entire city's worth of guilds, rivalries, and quiet reckonings kept turning, indifferent to any single person's story, except for the ones who refused to stay overlooked. Jihan intended to remain exactly that. Not overlooked, not discarded, not dismissed as dead weight ever again. But the gap between Kiros's decline and Epic's rise widened a little further with every mission, every certification, every quiet conversation with someone like Doha, or the woman at Dice Guild headquarters who clearly saw something worth investing in early. They would learn eventually, whether through Doha's expanding attention, through the association's growing interest, or through the widening gap between Epic's rise and Kiros's quiet decline, exactly how badly they had misjudged the man they'd thrown away. For now, Jihan let the sword's faint hum settle against his palm, watching the city lights spread out beneath a darkening sky, and allowed himself, at last, a small and steady certainty. Whatever waited next, whatever Dice Guild's larger operations eventually asked of him, whatever reckoning Kiros still had coming, he intended to meet it exactly the way he'd met everything since that night on the curb. Standing entirely on his own terms, the way he never once had been allowed to before. The association's formal confirmation of Epic's expanded certification arrived 4 days later, delivered not through the usual clerk, but by the same younger official who had shown quiet approval during Jihan's interview months earlier. "You should know this doesn't happen quietly," she said, setting the certification papers on the workbench with visible care. "Guilds that receive expanded status this early tend to draw attention from every direction, not just the friendly kind. Larger guilds sometimes see rapid rises as a challenge to their standing, rather than something to celebrate." Kim absorbed that carefully, glancing at the certification seal with a mixture of pride and wariness. "Are you warning us about someone specific?" "I'm warning you generally," the official said, though something in her tone suggested she knew more than she was willing to share outright. "Watch how the larger guilds respond over the next few weeks. Not everyone will be as gracious about Epic's rise as Do-ha Yoon has been." She left without further explanation, leaving Jihan and Kim to sit with the weight of an achievement that suddenly felt less like a finish line and more like the opening move in something considerably larger. That evening, sashimi arrived unannounced at the storage unit, uncharacteristically serious for someone who usually treated every conversation as an opportunity for casual banter. "Heard about your certification," he said, settling onto an overturned crate near the workbench. "Also heard some less pleasant things making the rounds through cleanup circles. A few of the bigger guilds aren't thrilled about an operation your size, climbing this fast without paying the usual dues." "Which guilds?" Jihan asked. Sashimi hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share. "Nothing concrete yet. Just grumbling, the kind that sometimes turns into something more deliberate if it's left alone too long. Figured you'd rather hear it early from someone in your corner than late from someone who isn't." Kim exchanged a glance with Jihan, the earlier evening's cautious optimism tempering into something more watchful. "Do-ha did say this one's different," she said quietly, remembering the conversation from the activist demonstration weeks earlier. "Maybe this is part of what she meant." "Maybe," Jihan agreed, turning the sword over slowly in his hands, Sylph's steady presence settling beneath his ribs like a quiet promise. "Then we prepare for that too." Outside, the district settled into evening the way it always did, indifferent to guild rivalries and expanded certifications and quiet grudges accumulating in Kiros's stubborn silence. But something in the air had shifted, subtly and unmistakably, the same way it had the night Sylph first chose him on a curb outside a shuttered noodle stand. Whatever came next, whatever the larger guilds intended by their grumbling, whatever Dice Guild's woman with the colored pins and careful questions still had planned, Jihan understood that his story had well and truly outgrown the quiet, discarded ending Kiros had once tried to write for him. They would learn eventually, whether through Do-ha's expanding attention, through the association's growing interest, or through the widening gap between Epic's rise and Kiros's quiet decline, exactly how badly they had misjudged the man they'd thrown away. But the reckoning waiting on the horizon no longer belonged to Kiros alone, not anymore. It belonged to an entire city of guilds who were about to learn, one by one, exactly what they'd underestimated. Kim found him still standing by the window long after Sashimi had left, the storage unit quiet except for the faint hum of the sword resting against his palm. "You're not worried," she observed, joining him at the window, studying the district lights scattered below like scattered embers refusing to fade. "I am, a little," Jihan admitted. "But worried isn't the same as unprepared. Kiros taught me that lesson without meaning to. Every fight I ever held alone for 7 years taught me how to stand against something bigger than myself and still come out the other side. And now you've got someone standing next to you instead of behind you," Kim said quietly. "Exactly," he said. "That's the part they never accounted for. They assumed removing me would simply erase whatever I was worth. They never imagined someone else might see it clearly enough to build something new around it." Kim was quiet for a moment, watching the lights below with the same careful attention she brought to every mission briefing. "Whatever the bigger guilds are planning, whatever Dice Guild ends up asking of us, I think we handle it the same way we've handled everything since that mutant fight. Together, and without apologizing for how fast we've grown. Together, Jihan agreed. Silp stirred faintly beneath his ribs, a quiet, steady presence that had never once wavered since the night it chose him on a curb outside a shuttered noodle stand, when everyone else in his life had already decided he was worth nothing at all. He thought, watching the district settle into full darkness beyond the cracked window, that Kiros's mistake had never really been expelling him. Guilds made mistakes constantly, cutting people loose who deserved better, discarding loyalty that should have been rewarded instead. Their true mistake had been simpler than that, and far more permanent. They had never once bothered to look closely enough to see what they were actually losing until it was already gone, standing somewhere else entirely, growing into something they could no longer recognize, let alone reclaim. Somewhere across the city, that reckoning was still building, quiet and patient, the way Sylph itself had once waited an entire lifetime for the right person to finally notice. It wouldn't stay quiet forever.